Ongi etorri Gutun Zuria Zabalik, Azkuna Zentroaren letren nazioarteko jaialdiaren programa edatura. Jarraian, Orhan Pamuk literaturako Nobel saridunaren Las noches de la peste liburuaren aurkezpena izango da. Idoia Jauregi kazetariarekin hizketan, idazleak bere azken eleberriaren sormen prozesua aztertuko du. Berrogeialdiko debekuei eta ezegonkortasun politikoari aurre egiten dieten protagonisten biziraupen eta borrokaren istorio bat. Iraganari emandako behakoa, ezinbestez orainaldiarekiko paralelismoak sortzen dituena. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a Gutun Zuria Zabalik, el programa expandido del Festival Internacional de las Letras de Azkuna Zentroa. A continuación tendrá lugar la presentación del libro Las noches de la peste, de Orhan Pamuk, Premio Nobel de Literatura. En conversación con la periodista Idoia Jauregi, el escritor abordará el proceso creativo de su última novela, una historia de supervivencia y lucha de unos protagonistas que lidian con las prohibiciones de la cuarentena y la inestabilidad política. Una mirada al pasado que genera inevitables paralelismos con el presente. Welcome to Gutun Zuria Zabalik, the expanded program of Azkuna Zentroa International Literature Festival. The presentation of Nobel Literature Prize winner Orhan Pamuk's book Nights of Plague will now take place. In conversation with journalist Idoia Jauregi, the writer will talk about the creative process of his latest novel, a story about the struggle and survival of the protagonists, who battle with the prohibitions of quarantine and political instability. A look at the past which generates inevitable parallels with the present.
Arratsaldeon.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Welcome, Mr. Pamuk. Thank you. Thank you for attending, especially today because it is a holiday. In spite of that, this session is really crowded. So this is a very special day because not only it is a holiday, but also because we have Mr. Pamuk with us. And this is the starting of his tour to promote his latest book. Tomorrow he'll be in Madrid and the day after in Barcelona. So thank you very much for coming here to Bilbao, to the Alhóndiga, and it is the second time he really pays this honor of being here for the second time. Thank you. Thank you very much for introducing here, for presenting Nights of a Plague. Thank you very much for presenting this book here in Bilbao. What could I say? Well, his trajectory is very well known. He's written many books. He's been awarded many prizes, even the Nobel Prize of Literature. And he's been translated into many languages. We can even read Snow, translated by Echeverria. And today we're presenting here Nights of a Plague. Isabel Gallar and Miguel Ángel Romero have translated this book into Spanish. And I'd like to say that we're going to have a conversation with Mr. Pamuk for some 40 minutes, and then during the last 10 minutes we will start a Q&A with the audience. So you can ask your question in English, Spanish, or Basque, but there is simultaneous translation into any of these languages. So we're ready to start. And I'd like to add something. At the end, he will not be signing books. even though he has previously signed some 50 books. So if you want to buy those books with his signature, you already have them for you available. So, good afternoon.
About your questions.
¿Cómo está usted? La primera pregunta, ¿cómo está usted?
How are you? This is the first question.
Well, I went to Guggenheim and Museum of Fine Arts today, and I am a museum lover, so I enjoyed myself. I'm happy being here.
Ha tenido la posibilidad de pasear y de ver esto.
So you've been walking around Bilbao and you've visited the museum, but I think you already visited the Guggenheim in 2014. Now you've been visiting the new exhibits.
Museum that once you have visited. It's permitted to visit museums twice.
Okay. Bueno, estuvo en este mismo escenario, como decíamos, en el 2014.
You were here in 2014 for the literature festival Gutun Zuria. And here we have you again to talk about this last book of yours, Nights of Plague. We're talking about a pandemic. And of course, we've got to mention a more recent pandemic that we're still going through. When did you start writing this book? Or when did you get this idea about writing this kind of book?
Thinking of this novel for the last 40 years, actually, 45 years. I read many years ago Albert Camus' Plague. I was almost a teenager, and I said to myself, one day I will also write a plague novel. Then it took 40 years to decide about its subject, 45 years to decide about it. First, I was thinking of more a metaphysical novel about death. Then for a while, I thought about writing about the prejudice of Western travelers who always write that people of Istanbul, Muslims, Ottomans, they don't care about quarantine. They just say it's coming from God, what can I do? So they're fatalists. For another 20 years, I thought about this will be the subject of my plague novel. Then in the last 10 years, I began reading about PhDs, doctorates, books, histories about plague and history, and I decided to set in the third plague pandemic. One reason was now my subject was continuously changing, although I was always preoccupied with a plague novel. One reason was this third plague pandemic, which started in 1897 in Asia, in China. It killed tens of millions of people, while almost no one was killed in Europe and in West. So since I am known as an East-West subject, a novelist, I thought this is an interesting subject. Then I also come across, again, reading books, thinking that in 19th century, there was a lot of cholera. In fact, the dominant epidemic in 19th century was cholera. And there were heavy cholera quarantines imposed by various governments. And in Russia and in Poland, there were quarantine uprisings. So I thought about that. That provoked my thinking. Then I thought about writing about a government imposing quarantine to uneducated Muslims, then an uprising. So that's how I started. So I read more. In fact, the authoritarian, so once there is an epidemic, the government has to be, almost without exception, should be authoritarian, because people both want two things simultaneously: that the government protect them from the epidemic, from the sickness, And also people want, oh, don't touch my business, don't touch my privacy, don't touch my friends, we'll walk in the street and go to coffee house. So it only, unfortunately, only authoritarian governments till the beginning of 20th century could stop epidemics. Maybe we are now, at the end of 21st century, more educated, and we follow, listen to quarantine because we are perhaps educated. But I wanted to write about a government, an organization, what we call state, getting authoritarian because of life conditions, inevitable. And perhaps because I did this, because my country, Turkey, the government was getting increasingly authoritarian, and I thought, well, after 45 years, finally, the time to write this novel started. Maybe I'll tell you another funny thing, that before me, the best novels about plague were written, I think. The first best book about plague is Daniel Defoe's The Journal of the Plague Year. Mm-hmm. The second one, I think, is Italian national epic Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed. And again, the third one is, as you all know, Albert Camus' Plague. And they were all written by writers who never experienced any epidemic. And I thought I will be the fourth one.
Bueno, estos son todos los orígenes de esta.
Well, these are the origins of this novel. So it started many years ago in your head, and also reading all these authors and all these works related to pandemics. But then what happens in that a pandemic does come? So when you are writing the book, does this modify some of what you had in mind to write?
This is the most popular question I've been asked in the last, after the epidemic started. First, my big friends who previously, when I was writing the novel, before the epidemic, my friends say, what? Plague, it's forgotten, who would read your novel? Then the same friends begin calling me, you're so lucky, saying, and at the same time, unfortunately, my 94-year-old aunt, my mother's sister, is one of the first victims of coronavirus in Istanbul, and she lived 2 streets away from me. Then I felt a sort of, writing a novel, I write slow, is a private thing. It felt as if I felt guilty because the epidemic, the virus, spread from my manuscripts to the world. Perhaps because I felt guilty, because people were saying I am lucky. Then I was also, my mind was worried that then everyone will say, oh, I wrote the novel after the coronavirus. So I wrote a long piece about, since I was more informed about these things, I read a lot of PhDs, doctorates, books, history of plague and Renaissance, history of plague there, history of plague there. And I had a sense of how humanity behaves when there is a pandemic. So I wrote a long article published first in New York Times and here, I think, in El País, all over the world. Both to express myself in a humankind's panicky mood because I'm knowledgeable, but also by the side to say, hey, I'm writing this novel for the last 3.5 years. Then the third funny thing, or if it's funny, then all of my publishers, 50 publishers, begin sending me or my agent emails saying, oh, Orhan, please finish your novel, so that they wanted to publish because it's topical. I also, human mind is full of illusions. When I was very happy trying to finish the novel, but I was simultaneously, just as I felt guilty in a wrong way, an illusion, I also thought very frankly, very sincerely, when my novel is finished, epidemic will also finish. That, at least in Turkey, didn't happen. I published a book now 13 months ago in Turkey, and there was an epidemic. And in fact, this is a sort of an answer to people who say, I'm lucky. Lockdowns were continuing in Turkey, and my book was selling well, very, very much. I was happy. But then there is another lockdown. And in lockdowns, I'm privileged because I have a bodyguard. So even in lockdown, I can walk around and take photos. I'm also an amateur photographer. So if police stops us, me and my bodyguard says, police, and I continue taking photos. But I was walking in High Street, Istanbul, a street which is very crowded, now all empty. The biggest bookshop, the window is the tower of my books, but there is no one to buy them. So life is full of ironies, and as some people say, ironies of life you can never invent. Life is more imaginative than the writer's imagination.
Son las imágenes que nos ha dejado esta pandemia.
Yes, these are some images that we've seen in this pandemic and that then we see in your book. This happened more than 100 years ago. And maybe this is precisely shocking to us, surprising, because when we need Nights of a Plague, there are full paragraphs that could be written nowadays. Okay, let's talk about your book. 1901, an island in the Mediterranean. Why in this geographical area?
Island, because I like situations of isolation. One of my previous novels, Snow, is also a novel, a political novel like this one. And this is not entirely a political novel, but heavily political like Snow. Takes place in a northern eastern town of Kars. In the novel, it snows so much that the place is isolated. Here, it's an island and a quarantine. They're also isolated. Isolated situation is a literary invention. We human beings are very curious when, say, an airplane falls to the Amazon, 10 people survive, some of them eat each other or whatever. Human mind is very busy with that. Or a ship sinks, then they're on a raft, as in Garcia Marquez even wrote a journalistic novella about this, or famous Medusa's raft. Again, these are stories of isolation. In cases of isolation, drama goes fast. What is hidden in human spirit comes out, or what is hidden in society gets in isolation more visible, I think. So I wanted to, also I want to add that I have a lot of respect for Daniel Defoe, who wrote the first novel of isolation, Robinson Crusoe, and who wrote the best novel of plague, The Journal of the Plague Year. Let me say, great Daniel Defoe. He was a very creative person, always writing for money. So I thought isolation also makes history move fast. My characters in this imaginary Minger Island experience, say, the history French lived in 200 years. They experienced that in 20 months, 3 months. And I also wanted to make my novel political. That's why I chose an island. And I chose an imaginary island because not Crete, another one, or Cyprus, or other islands I know in Eastern Mediterranean, because I also want to write A, an allegorical novel, B, a realist novel. And I didn't want my critics to say, oh, that didn't happen, that king was 3 days earlier, you get this wrong. I didn't want to have realistic arguments about getting the history right. I wanted to show history. My novel is accurate, or at least I think so, I research a lot for daily life details, what they eat, how they behave, telegraph, photography, a little bit of electricity, this or that, the fashions in Europe, objects, things, communication, boats, these are all realistic, and I research them very carefully. But politics, it's the politics of an imaginary island. But yes, generally speaking, the politics there are the politics of whole humanity in such situations, or how, as the empires, let's say Austria-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, as they fell apart, we had a lot of new small states. Suddenly, a person is coming, you're Mingarian, your language is different, you have to have a new flag, a new country. So I also wanted to write about that.
O sea que en un aislamiento, claro, todo está.
So in isolation, everything is more like concentrated, everything is concentrated in the island, and they live these characters in a very intense way that time. And the real characters, which will be the characters that you would say are the main characters in your novel?
The doctor who was sent there by AbdulHamid, the Turkish autocrat for 34 years. He's a sort of a male Queen Victoria of Turkey. That is, he was the biggest Ottoman last ruler, not because he was a good guy, he was an autocrat, but he was also a westernizer in medicine, in hospitals. He invented political Islam, but on the other hand, he was very interested in industrialization of Ottoman Empire, modernization of medicine, farming. These developments he cared about. Politically, he was very repressive. He closed the parliament and put people who criticized him into jail, and these all sort of things I also thought maybe also talk to today's Turkey. So that's one of, not only one motivation to write a novel. Maybe I should put it this way. I write, and most of the novelists write a novel not for one single motivation. There are so many reasons to choose a subject. So there's a political side to it. And I also, frankly, love the Eastern Mediterranean Greek islands, Cyprus, or some of them Muslim, Turkish, Greek are living together. So in the long run, if you ask me, what interested you most politically in this novel, you didn't ask me, but I'm telling you, is that, in fact, I want to write about the fact that as the empires fell apart and various kings, shahs, padishahs, sultans, kaisers begin to disappear, then a new secular world opened, or need to be opened. But these kings or sultans were perceived by the people as a sort of a religious leader. Some of them are called the shadow of God, or some of them have even godly attribute qualities. Some of them may be a bit more secular, but in the end, they are also running the church. The Ottoman ruler is a caliph, the president, the head of all Muslims. So when he disappears, then normal citizen, uneducated person is lost. How would you send him to war and kill others or sacrifice his life? So when empires fell, the kings, sultans fell, but then they are important to motivate people. Before, during the time of Ottoman Empire, people would never say, I am dying for my people or for my flag. People begin to die for their people, for their flag, after the invention of national states. Before that, they were dying for their king. Now the king disappeared. You have to invent a new legend, a mythology. My novel is partly about the invention of these secular mythologies. For example, the would-be hero founder of the Republic meets a girl in the kitchen, it's dark, and they have a little conversation in the dark with this strange language. Later it's exaggerated, and we see it's in the high school text, everyone memorize it. I want to follow this again. This was not the only subject, but a subject that interested me along with epidemics, psychology of epidemics, how we behave when there is a pandemic, how we behave when we are scared to death and think there is no way out or something like that.
Mire, un párrafo de la novela dice así, a esas...
Your novel says, well, Rams and the more educated Muslims were already aware that they were about to see a catastrophe, but some Icelanders thought they could not even, were not afraid because they could not even think that far. Do you think that happened? When we got the first news, we were not really able to see the scope of what was coming.
And there are lots of differences. What we today experience and what 100 years ago people experienced. First, we have to be honest about it. We are much more educated than those people. Only 5% of Ottoman people were able to read and write, and most of them were Greek Orthodox. Muslims were really people, the peasants were not educated. So it is hard to convince them to take quarantine measures. They frankly think, just as in medieval times, it's a sort of punishment coming from God. I don't think this is coming from the nature of Islam. This is coming from nature of uneducation, just ignorance. And once this happens also, communities, their leaders get more power because there is the government is saying something and they have the power to say no. But I forgot your initial question, I'm sorry.
No, yo lo que decía es...
So after seeing these lines in your books, where people did not really see the catastrophe coming because they didn't have the capacity to imagine that much, do you think that happened to us as well? We could not anticipate what was coming, what the COVID pandemic was going to be like.
It is. Today, first of all, plague killed one in 3, while this coronavirus, even at the worst time, everyone was saying, killed 1 in 100. Yet, we were proportionally more afraid. We were not afraid as the times of plague, but we were heavily afraid, comparable to medieval plague. Why? My answer, every night we saw on TV people entubed. I was scared. I'm over 65. I thought, my God, if this happens, I have to keep my social distance. And now, having information, being scared was also good, because once you're scared, you listen to the government. You don't fight with the government saying, oh, my individuality, or I don't, maybe it's Americans CIA put something into this corona shot or what. We listen so that we want to survive. And in order to survive, you have to be scared. In order to that you follow regulations of quarantine, you have to be afraid of death. It was good, in a way, to be informed. And since we were informed, since we were not only we are educated compared to old times, we have TV, every night news, immense communications. Look at Daniel Defoe, and Daniel Defoe wrote his novel. He didn't experience plague. His uncle did. He found, as the scholars tell us, his uncle's notebook about plague days, and made it look like a novel a bit. It's not a novel, actually. He really definitely needed a good editor, but anyway. But he's so talented. But in that, whatever we call it, a novel or a long essay, two people, one is coming from north of London, the other one is coming south of London, meet in the heavy plague. 1 in 3 is dying. So they talk. It's not, they talk, what's there? Oh, horrible. And the other one says, what's there? Oh, horrible. That's the only information they have. You have to survive in this. They're not looking at TV. They're not reading newspapers. They're not looking at numbers and graphs. They are trying, in a heartfelt way, trying to survive deep in a pandemic, while they were scared because people are dying. Even if they're ignorant, they're sick because they're lying 1 in 3, like fleas, like, insects. While we are not dying that much, thank God, but we are also scared for other reasons. Human reaction to pandemics sometimes are essentially the same. There are things that we are still behaving like medieval. First, denial, then a lot of gossip, then denial and gossip. It's, oh, you Jews, you Muslims, you Christians bought it, or whatever. Your Greeks bought it, Turks bought it, Germans bought it, Chinese bought it. A lot of gossip. Then all this, denial and this, governments cannot control. The first, government denies it. When government sees a lot of bodies going, then it's already too late. The numbers, go up. Sometimes governments collapse, as in Renaissance, governments collapsed in Florence, but then they were volunteers, new governments, or uprisings in cholera uprisings. These were also provoked my thinking and my imagination.
Sí,
In your novel, the Pasha says that he thought he was being shaken by this wave of the pandemic, by this pandemic that is really strong. So the authorities also felt shaken by the pandemic. But we now have a different information that they had in the past. How can we then explain people denying? Many people were denials, and it is still an important movement.
Understand the psychology of the denier. I am a novelist, and I'm sometimes proud to say my job is to understand, put myself in the shoes and the mind of a person who is entirely different than me, such as I did such a thing in all of my novels, but a good example can be the character of Blue in my novel, Snow. He is an Islamic fundamentalist. He also kills people because of that. But I did my best to understand him, to not legitimize him. The overall composition of my novel is perhaps critical of it. But I want to understand why he's doing that, and also want my readers to say, yes, now I understand why a person is an Islamic fundamentalist. This is not necessarily meaning approving him. But for me, I would love to write about the mental dialectics, progress of a denier. For me, it's also hard to understand. So I don't want to make general comments. Why do they deny? For me, it's puzzling. I cannot give you hints. Maybe they are angry to the government and take this as an opportunity to say, make a loud no, no, whatever you say, no. I have seen in United States, where I am also going to America once because I'm teaching at Columbia. I met a very successful doctor who knows medicine is good, who knows the shot. He's a doctor and a successful doctor, yet he was a denier in many ways. He was not saying there's no sickness, and vaccination is not good. But he was saying, what about our freedom? What about this? What about that? You cannot touch my body. It's not constitutional, so forth and so on. It's a fragile thing. Let me give you a Turkish example. Relatively speaking, in United States, what I saw, that the ideology or representatives of deniers are in the newspapers. They are serious people. Some of them are a bit, by my standards, a bit cranky. But in Turkey, they are not represented. They are not in the newspapers. It may be in the social media, perhaps because the newspapers are controlled by Erdogan's party and they want to stop it, frankly. Maybe I should also tell that I'm critical of Erdogan for so many things, for putting so many writers, journalists in jail, some of them my friends, or finishing of Turkish democracy. But he did not handle coronavirus pandemic crisis worse than others. In fact, irony of life, in March 2020, I was in New York teaching, bang, it started, we all remember that panic movement in world. Everyone was going home. That was also psychologically important. At that time, 2000, March, Trump was saying in New York, it will pass in April, and he was going to church. I flew to Istanbul, afraid that I'm very nervous. Maybe I'll finish my novels. That's the only thing in my last month, something like that. And there's a mosque next to me, which I can see from my window. There is a paper on the mosque saying, because of coronavirus, all the mosques are closed. So the Islamist Erdogan was behaving like an ultra-secular, while modern American president was behaving like a very medieval person. But of course, Erdogan could not continue with this secularist attitude. After a while, he realized that this is too much, and he opened up a bit. Again, it went up, then again, he closed it a bit. It continued like that.
Tenemos...
There is a political history in this novel. There is the story also, the history of the pandemic with all the details about daily life. It is really realistic and there is also a detective plot because you're looking for those people that killed some people. There are some killings. I'm not going to reveal this, but there are a couple of killings. There are two theories. Some people are sort of like Sherlock Holmes in order to follow the cues and find the killers, because we have a sultan that likes Conan Doyle.
One of the main characters of my novel is AbdulHamid. He was an autocrat. But look, he was just like Queen Victoria of England. He was the most important because first he lived for 34 years. He was in throne. So much change. He was an Islamist in a way, but he was also modernizing the country. In the novel, we don't see his presence, but we see him as a person interested in detective novels. But AbdulHamid, coincidentally, was addicted to read detective novels because he just simply liked them, and he also had a bit paranoid mind. So he frankly enjoyed. One of his secretaries wrote his memoirs, and my novel is, I have to tell you, based on the memoirs of a lot of Ottoman pashas or AbdulHamid's entourage, so to speak. While he behaved like an autocrat in many ways, suppressed free speech, this or that, and celebrated traditional methods and a very conservative, but he also one enjoyed Sherlock Holmes. What is Sherlock Holmes? That, in fact, is a human fantasy, that a very intelligent guy sits at a table, looks at the clues, and comes up with a solution. It is not convincing for me, but it's nice to read. It's like someone who is playing chess blindfolded or something. Sherlock Holmes is so clever. AbdulHamid enjoyed Sherlock Holmes, which I can from this deduce that there is a killing in my island, okay? So he also wants it to be, this is not historical now. AbdulHamid liked Conan Doyle, even gave him some medal and invited him to Turkey. Let's forget that. He enjoyed it. From that, I deduced, now that's my imagination, he wants to solve this murder, an important medical pasha, to be solved in Sherlock Holmes ways. What do I mean by that? What do we understand by that? He wants the problem to be solved. And till recently, or still again in Turkey, if you have a legal problem and someone is not confessing, well, it's easy. You beat him. In 10 minutes, he tells you all the truth. Then it's easy. You don't need a Sherlock Holmes in a country where they torture you, you know. While AbdulHamid probably was fantasizing that problems should be solved like Sherlock Holmes. But my book is perhaps saying, is it possible that if you have such a culture of oppression and such a culture of tormenting people and legal system till recently is made up of torturing. In Ottoman times, there was a legal torturer, you know. They had, so they go and torture. It's, you know, you also had some inquisition here. You understand what I mean?
Conan Doyle es una de las referencias.
Conan Doyle is a reference in this novel, and another reference from the literature is Orhan Pamuk. He's also a character, or it's mentioned at least, the narrator mentions you.
I appear in my novels once, just like Hitchcock appearing has a little appearance, but that I don't change the plot. No. Yeah, Hitchcock also doesn't say, I'm Hitchcock, hello, or doesn't take it much. Also, you know, in my early years, I was a radical postmodernist. It's a way of saying to the reader, hey, this is a fiction, don't lose yourself too much. A little bit of a Bertolt Brecht alienation effect appearing in my novel. But don't take it too seriously. In the end, I don't mean too much by that. It's a sort of signature.
Esta mención está en la parte final cuando la...
So you are mentioned at the end when the narrator, she tells what happened afterwards, once the events are finished, years after. And she says that this habit of killing writers and journalists on the streets with the tacit support of the state is a tradition that is still alive. Even this started more than 100 years ago. And I think this has been an issue. I mean, you had an issue also with justice in your country because of the Armenian genocide and what you said, and also with this book.
Yes, that's a sad detail. It's not even a detail, it's a graver thing. But for example, my friend, Armenian journalist Hrant Dink, who talked a bit about the genocide, was killed. After that, Erdogan government gave me 3 bodyguards, and I lived for quite a long time with them. Now, I have only 1, so I sometimes joke if they ask me too much politics, oh, don't criticize Turkey. I used to have 3, now 1, we are improving. Yes, that the killing of journalists in the streets was, in fact, a long tradition in Turkey. I hope it will pass away, but it's also a sign of there is some democracy. Why, you would say? Because if it's in China, they're not killing journalists in the street because they put them in prison, no one says anything. If the government cannot stop, if there is a slight democracy and you cannot stop the journalists by legal methods, then most of these killings are organized secretly by the government, by the way, then they kill him. But have you seen any journalists killed in the street by a person in China or in Russia? Russia kills people in England because they cannot stop, there is some democracy there. So ironically, killing journalists in the street is a sign that there is some democracy there. They cannot stop that journalist by putting him in jail because then it's unlawful. Then they kill him. Also, it's also related to the fact that it's intolerance. You know, Gandhi was killed by a fanatic. I don't think it was organized by secret Indian governments, that a fanatic killed Gandhi because he was saying to Hindus that we have to tolerate and be nice to Muslims. You're asking me a political question. Are they killing journalists there, Orhan? Not that I know this year, but it may happen. I still have my bodyguard, and in fact, sometimes I say to my wife, well, maybe I don't want any more bodyguard. I have him for 20 years. And she says, no. Maybe something will happen, you know? And she is right. And there is this investigation just about this book because I am ironical or making ironical remarks about the founder of Turkish state, Kemal Atatürk. First of all, I was not. But once there is something like that in the newspapers, and of course, as you know, media is always exaggeration, then yes, there may be a fanatic who would not kill me, but punch me in the face. My bodyguard always says that, sir, I'm here not for organized killing. If there's an organized killing, we'll go together. I'm here, I'm your bodyguard here, so that no one will punch you or even more, say nasty things to you in the street, insult you, shout at you, then you lose a few days, and that happened to me a lot. That is also makes you sad. So the bodyguard is for that.
En todo caso, la acusación por...
In a way, this accusation is not supporting itself from a legal point of view. I think it was a weak accusation. Is it forgotten already, or it's still lingering?
Happened. I behaved a bit. I went to a lawyer, and my lawyer is such a wise guy, 10 years older than me. He is the founding member of all the communist and socialist parties that were all closed, banned by the government in Turkey. But he is a wise guy. He said, first his reaction, Mr. Pamuk, do you want this to be big or small? I didn't understand it. Then I understood it. Do you want public attention with this? And I said, no. For 3 months, I went to the public prosecutor and didn't tell anyone anything. I was behaving a bit, maybe not politically correctly. Then it leaked to the public, and it was all in the newspapers. When I went to the public prosecutor, he said, you know, there are so many complaint letters, you know, this is how sometimes public prosecutors operate in Turkey. You write, Pamuk is insulting this, insulting that, and there are so many letters sent by very repressive nationalists, actually. Then he has to do something, and perhaps some people also arm twisting him, open a case. In the end, my lawyer said, and he's a wise lawyer, Mr. Pamuk, don't worry, nothing will happen. Yes, I think I agree. I don't have much anxiety, but on the other hand, for example, my friends in the United States don't understand this will not work. How can they do? Well, it's a part of a political struggle. So let's say there are good high school teachers, Democrats, leftists, liberals, Kurds, who give my book in universities who give my book to the students. Now, when it is in the newspapers, their enemies will attack them, then they will be afraid, you know, he insulted flag, he insulted Kemal Atatürk, he insulted Turkishness, and you're still giving him. There will be in private schools, right-wing or authoritarian people, well, I don't want my children to read this guy, buy a book, this guy, this kind of thing. You know, even the baby public prosecutor knows that I won't end in jail. But once you have this thing, then it's in the media. They write. Then your enemies call the insulter of Turkish flag, and Kemal Atatürk did this, the insulter, and on it continues. Most of the time, this case is more like that. I was also sent to court talking about Armenian genocide, but that was more deadly. Then I really needed 3 bodyguards.
Hablemos de...
Let's talk about women. The narrator is a woman, and one of the main characters is a woman. And you also say that in Ottoman world, women are confined in harems as if they were caged birds and treated by men as slaves or as pieces of decoration. What is it like for women in current Turkey?
It's not Ottoman Turkey, and having 2 wives is forbidden and illegal in secular Turkey. Let's get this right. But yes, you're asking me, how does it feel to be in harem? Then I would call you an Orientalist. I was not in a harem, but I can imagine it's a horrible place. It's not an American fantasy. Harem was real. And in fact, as a novelist, the essential problem of writing historical novels in a Muslim country is women are in harem. They don't go out the street, especially upper-class women never left home, never left the mansions. Lower-class women perhaps went to buy fruit and we care about children. But for a novelist, it is a paradox. You want to write about women, but they are not in social life. They are only either in harem or home or in kitchen at most. I wrote a historical novel, My Name is Red, and various chapters are seen through the eyes of Shekure, the mother of 2 children. Then I was, actually, Shekure doesn't leave home. There is a Jewish clothes seller who goes from home to home carrying both clothes and gossip. She is the woman who is walking, navigating in the streets. I see the town from her female eyes, but we rarely see Shekure, who is a middle class, let's say, compared with today's language, because it is the problem of Muslim novel, not today. Even in all countries, women go out now, but 100 years ago, in cities, Muslim women, educated Muslim women, if they are educated, in harem, they were educated. I also wrote this novel to write about a bit Ottoman aristocracy, if we can call them aristocracy, the royal palace, people that surround, they were very westernized. AbdulHamid may be autocrat, and perhaps he was forced to invent Islamism. But they were all piano reading Balzac, and doing Western things, while their husbands had slave girls on one side, sophisticated aristocratic girls, they marry another side, very complex. And I want to write a novel, of course, with women. And there is also what they belittle, make fun of, as political correctness. That I want, as I get older, I want to see my fiction, my stories, more through women's eyes. A novelist is a person who represents the others and wants to see wants to imagine a world from the point of view of a woman. And it's a self-imposed, and I accept this self-imposition, lovely imposition, to see the world, and I want to see the world more through female characters. Some say this is political correctness. No, it is moral, and being moral and just to other people, and is not something to be ridiculed at.
Pues hemos llegado a ese momento.
Okay, so I think now we will give the floor also to the audience. I think there's a wireless microphone so people can make questions.
En esta conversación, vamos a ver si tenemos ya... Sí, tenemos aquí una mano de momento en esta segunda fila.
So somebody here in the second rank? What would you tell and do to the authors of the current pandemic? What would you tell and do to the authors of the current pandemic? Authors, the makers. She means that sounds very funny.
Pandemic, I don't think we are experiencing something that is self-consciously with intentions organized by anybody. Like many things, like fires, earthquakes, this or that. We can understand it because this happened, that happened, maybe in that Chinese town something happened. It started from there, perhaps. But I don't believe in conspiracy theories. Maybe sometimes conspiracy theories are true. But it is, no one wrote that this should happen. I don't think so. I think, but I don't want to engage in an argument with you. There are other people who want to ask questions, I see. So, take the microphone and give it to others.
No has contestado porque era una hipótesis.
Any further questions? Apart from this book and In Snow, in the books that I've read, I think this and Snow are the only ones which are not mainly based or located in Istanbul. Am I right?
It's not a coincidence, I think, because also a very good question that enlightened me. When I write about politics, I choose imaginary or ideal places. Why? Because if you write in real places, then the political message that I want to convey is mixed up with the local realities, which you have to get it right. And I don't want to argue about whether this figure or that real figure is good or bad. I want to get my message right. I don't want to say so-and-so prime minister was bad or this was good, this is so-and-so's fault. I'm a novelist, not a historian. So when I have a strong political message, with the help of your question, I realize I invent imaginary places, ideal places, so that my message will be clear-cut, and isolated places, because then, as we have talked, history moves, events move more dramatically and in a more concentrated way. in isolated places? Thank you for your question.
No, mi pregunta era...
But my question is whether we could hope to visit, through your novels, other places of Turkey. I would especially like to read a novel happening in Izmir. You mention it, but only like remotely. It is a wish that he is expressing.
Reminds me of, sometimes I do tourism Turkey, or I used to live in a small island, now in a different, where sometimes the restaurant owner says, Mr. Pamuk, why don't you write a novel about our place so that tourists will come? I always get this response from restaurant owners, tourism managers, hotel owners. Why don't you write a place about our place so that tourists come? But this is the first time I see a would-be tourist is asking me to write about some town. Maybe I connect you with the restaurant owner in Izmir so that I don't have to write the novel.
Presiones que reciben los escritores.
Well, this is the pressure that many writers get. Often, write about this, write about this place. Is this common?
In my early years, they're not doing that anymore. Someone is enthusiastically stops you. Come, I want to tell you my story. It's a real novel. I am sure it happens to novelists all over the world. And sometimes you really hear interesting stories and you're confused, maybe I write it. But in the end, maybe because I'm getting old, people are not asking that anymore. But yes, that kind of novel writing, and a lot of novelists do that. That is, for example, in order to write A Strangeness in My Mind, two novels earlier, I worked with young assistants who were researching and doing interviews with a tape recorder to street vendors of Istanbul, how they produce this, how much money they make, how is their life conditions, a sort of oral history. I had a lot of piles of, and they were then printed or registered, whatever. I have a whole piles of interviews with people about realities of life. How, I am not a street vendor, but I wrote 600 pages of a novel about a street vendor. How did I do it? Of course, half of it is my imagination, but half of it is research. Either I do it, I also invited yogurt sellers, and people, when they trust you, the social class difference disappears. Suddenly, the yogurt seller is very happy and is telling everything about his life. And I like that part of being a novelist. Also, I choose a subject. For example, just like plague, for the last 30 years, I am thinking of the story of, say, the taxi driver. That we have shared taxi drivers. So you see that he's driving a taxi, but the taxi is stopped by, just like a bus, there is no taxi stop, but you say, you do this, then you go into it, you give 50 kurush from this place to that place. And in my childhood, when Istanbul was small, people were more friendly, more peasant-like two villagers, immediately knowing each other, they began chatting. And the taxi driver orchestrate the conversation driving, and there used to be, no, I agree, disagree, and the whole car, people are talking. I still think I may write this, a novel seen through the eyes of a shared taxi driver, that is, a person who is going around all over in Istanbul. Then his customers, sometimes 3 people, 4 people, 3 people, 2 people, all argue with each other, and to see this town through the eyes of this taxi driver. I have endless projects, but life is short, you know.
Ese taxista que va recogiendo.
So, but anyway, I told you this because in order to be able to write that novel, I have to do a lot of interviews with taxi drivers, and I'm sure they will be forthcoming. But you know, so many projects. Again, yes.
Pero esa será la siguiente novela.
Is that going to be your next novel? Are you already working into it?
Maybe I should have started with that one, but I am working a sort of an autobiographical novel now. A novel in which, you know, I wanted to be a painter till the age of 22, and I chronicled that in my autobiography of a book, Istanbul. Then now I want to write about the story of a failed Turkish painter. He dies, his best friend writes about his life. There is drama. That's all now I can say.
Bueno, sí, tenemos otra.
Okay, another question. And I think this is the last one. We are running out of time. I really liked the book when you move from the big empire like the Ottoman Empire into national government. And you also explained that here, how symbols change. You don't fight for your king or your sultan, but now you fight for a flag. What are the symbols of the new nations? Do you think new nations are better than the big empires that would put together different people? Do new nations need new symbols, as we see in your novel, that are created, having nothing to do with reality, really? And also in relation to new language, with
Empires were more tolerant to their peoples. How beautiful it was to have empires, because multi-ethnic empires generated multi-ethnic big cities. Istanbul was one of them. When Chateaubriand came to Istanbul in mid-19th century, he gets out of the boat and says, my God, they were speaking 10 languages around: Arabic, Turkish, Persian, Greek, French, and all these crowds. He was amazed by this. Yes, we all have the ideal of tolerance to other languages, other ethnicities, this or that. But for me, it's not an excuse of admiring empires. How beautiful was empires, you know? That you cannot say. When you have an empire, there is always a ruling nation. In Ottoman Empire, the ruling nation was Muslims. They were not even a nation, or a religion. The Christians were not allowed to bureaucracy and army. While on the other hand, as modernity came, Christians were more educated, especially Orthodox, more sophisticated, more knowledgeable, and freedom that AbdulHamid or Turkish Muslim ruling elite, if they want to be westernized, be close to Europe, the more they gave freedom, the more it's an open society and privileges of Muslims and equal citizens, then Christians were doing better. They were getting richer, more educated, and that was also problem at the heart of AbdulHamid or even this novel, because they were more skilled in crafts, in business, in many things, while Muslims, the elite of the Muslims, the Ottoman ruling elite, was good in writing countings, bureaucracy, judgment, and soldiers, and running the country. So I cannot put empires on a pedestal, but sometimes empires look tolerant. In that sense, the rulers of empires has to be tolerant, although he belongs to an elite group, whether it's Muslim or whether it's Germanness or whether it's Christianity. There is an elite, but after the elite, everyone is equal to another, and there is a tolerance of multiculturalism in an empire. But on the other hand, it's also, but that doesn't make me romanticize empires. I don't, just like I don't romanticize single nation states where one language, and if you speak another language. In my childhood, you know, when we just mentioned Chateaubriand came to Istanbul, half of the population of Istanbul didn't speak, at home, didn't speak Turkish. They were Christians. And lots of this or that happened, but not killings, but especially in Istanbul, no killings because of war, this or that. Christians, Greek Orthodox left Istanbul, but there was a residue of them. In my high school class, 35 in classroom, 6 or 7 were either Armenians, Jews, or Greeks, but they were mistreated by patriots, or patriot is the wrong one, nationalists in the bus. They were Greeks or they were speaking Greek in the bus. Then someone says, hey, this is Turkey, speak Turkish. So I cannot idealize national state, nor I can idealize an empire.
Bueno, pues si no hay ninguna otra petición.
Okay, so this was the last. Okay, we have a last question. I want to ask you about what's going on in the world about authoritarianism and the success of some authoritarian movements, so-called national populism, and what all this is creating, the leadership of Trump or Mr. Putin's leadership, and also in the case of Turkey, even though if this is through other means, and also in the Philippines. So how do you see this? How about the future? Could we be optimistic given this situation that we are?
Want to be optimistic, of course. I really cannot say a deep thing about, yes, there is a strong right-wing populist tendency and it will sweep everyone. I don't know. You know, I can give you a clearer answer 1 week later when we see if Macron or Le Pen wins in France. If Le Pen wins, everyone say, oh, authoritarian or nationalistic. If Macron wins, they say something else. But in the nationalism or racism that's growing up, there is one thing that triggers it. Immigration from poor Asian, Muslim, or African countries to Europe, of course, unfortunately, triggered all this sometimes racist, fascistic authoritarianism. This is what's happening. It's saying what's happening is not saying an excuse, but they are highly linked. Just like some time ago, Germans didn't want to see Turks around too much. They were living in their ghettos. Unfortunately, Europeans don't want to see blacks and Muslims and other Asians around because of they're taking their jobs, because they're afraid, because what we call racism, this or that, they are around. And the reason the racism or I wouldn't call this nationalism more, it's racism is around, other races are around. Once you have a single race, there won't be any racism. But we also wish that people tolerate each other. My job as a novelist is not only saying the ideal things, but also underlining why this is happening. I think if I feel that I have written a good chapter, a good book, if I both be able to criticize, say, racism, and then tell also why it's happening, but telling why it's happening is not excusing it all the time. They say, oh, you're excusing it. No, I'm telling why it's happening. I'm not a racist, you know, or I'm not a bad guy. I'm explaining why bad guys are around.
Bueno, pues me gustaría terminar con esta cita que podemos...
I'd like to finish with this quote. The art of novel is the skill to write the tale of our lives as if they were the lives of somebody else, and to do so, and also to do so, writing about somebody else's as if this was our own life. So
Thank you for saying that.
Un placer que continúe ese
so
viaje por Madrid, por Barcelona.
well, hope you enjoy this tour in Madrid and Barcelona. Hope to see you again with your new book.
Una cosa, hay libros firmados por Orhan Pamuk.
He's letting people know that you've signed 50 books and that they can buy them outside this auditorium.